Good evening and welcome to the Montante Cultural Center. Before this evening event begins, there are a few items we'd like to make you aware of and bring to your attention. Restrooms are located in front of the foyer. For your enjoyment and for yourself and others, audience members, we urge you to please silence all electronic devices. Emergency exits are located on the sides and rear of the auditorium. In an unlikely event of emergency, please move quickly and calmly to the nearest exit. Thank you and enjoy tonight's speaker.
Good evening and welcome both to those here in person in this great space and to those joining via live stream. We're glad to have you with us this afternoon for this 2023 William H. Fitzpatrick Chair of Political Science Lecture. I'm Richard Bailey, an Associate Professor of History here at Canisius College and the Fitzpatrick Professor of History. In this capacity, I get to collaborate with members of the Fitzpatrick family, such as John, Paul, Lauren, Catherine, Sarah, Molly, and Paula, college leadership, such as President Stout and Vice President of Academic Affairs, Sarah Morris, and faculty colleagues to help bring speakers to campus. The Fitzpatrick Lecture Series is part of the larger Fitzpatrick Institute of Public Affairs and Leadership, which since 1958 has provided a variety of opportunities for Canisius students to develop leadership potential through close contact with and exposure to those who contribute to American public affairs and social issues. The Institute, the lecture series, and the Fitzpatrick Professorship of History are named for William H. Fitzpatrick, a South Buffalo builder and longtime chair of the Erie County Democratic Party. His sons, Paul and Walter, endowed the Fitzpatrick programming at Canisius in 1958 in memory of their father. In 1962, Harry S. Truman, 33rd President of the United States, inaugurated the Fitzpatrick Lecture Series. Each year since, the college has hosted national figures in politics, government, academia, and media, including the likes of Jane Goodall, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Richard Hofstadter, Sidney Hook, Carl Bernstein, and Cornel West. The main voice you'll hear from most of our time together, our Fitzpatrick lecturer this evening, is the novelist, playwright, essayist, and activist Silas House. He is New York Times best-selling author of 7 novels, including the Appalachian trilogy Clay's Quilt, A Parchment of Leaves, and The Cold Tattoo, a volume of creative nonfiction, Something's Rising, which he co-authored with Jason Kyle Howard, 4 plays, and numerous essays and articles published in venues such as The Atlantic, The New York Times, Time Magazine, The Bitter Southerner, The Oxford American, and Garden and Gun. A former commentator for NPR's All Things Considered, House has received numerous accolades and awards for his work. For example, in the last 3 years, he was chosen as the Appalachian of the Year, received the Governor's Award from Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, and was the recipient of the Duggins Award, the largest award for an LGBTQ writer in the nation. His most recent novel, Lark Ascending, was the winner of the 2023 Southern Book Prize for Fiction. And as of this afternoon's official announcement, he is the new Poet Laureate of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. While you can order his titles wherever good books are sold, I do feel compelled at this moment to encourage you to seek out your local independent bookstore, and especially, as you might have noticed as you came in and enjoyed part of the pre-talk reception, we're grateful that Jonathan Welch from Buffalo's own Talking Leaves bookstore is here with many of these titles this evening, and certainly he can order other titles that he doesn't have with him. After the talk, there'll be a time of question and answer. We've got some microphones set up. I want to encourage you to make your way to the microphones so that it will be picked up on the live stream and the recording. Now, if you'll indulge me a bit for a more personal introduction. My first interaction with Silas House, which I guarantee I haven't asked him, but I know he doesn't remember, came in 2016 when I attended the Carnegie Center of Lexington's annual Books in Progress conference as part of a research of a larger project I'm working on the Kentucky author Wendell Berry. He was the keynote speaker that year. As part of the conference, I attended a few workshops, one on memoir writing, led by Fenton Johnson, and one on the responsible use of dialect in one's writing. Silas led that second workshop. And even as someone who doesn't write the sort of work about which he was talking, his treatment of the subject fascinated and encouraged me to think more about the responsibility that authors have in their work. So I picked up his novel Clay's Quilt that very day. A few years later, I came across his name again in the pages of Garden and Gun magazine in his article, Wendell Berry, the Poet of Place. As I read their conversation, it reminded me of similar exchanges I had shared with Wendell, except Silas asked much better questions. We crossed paths on a few other occasions in the bluegrass, and each time I was impressed. What impressed me even more, though, was how some of our mutual friends beam with pride every time Silas's name is mentioned. You see, all of these folks, many of whom I still share lunch with in the form of as Ed McClanahan, one of the members of this group, former members of this group, labeled it during our COVID Zoom sessions, a weekly salon. All these folks love Appalachia, and they beam because they know Silas House does too. They trust him, as one such friend put it, as a, quote, original and humane voice who cares for them. Having read much of the work he's written as a musical journalist, I know that Silas and I share some similar musical interests. I knew that even before our conversations today. One of those interests, a multiple Grammy winner who grew up about 30 minutes west of me down Highway 72 in North Alabama, Jason Isbell, wrote a song that was included on the Drive-By Truckers' 2003 album, Decoration Day. In that song, titled Outfit, Isbell, writing as a father giving his son advice, sings, "Don't worry about losing your accent. A Southern man tells better jokes." As you hear this afternoon from Silas, this claim doesn't only apply to telling jokes, but also to speaking hard and necessary truths. So please join me in welcoming Silas House as he shares Appalachia, Complicated Love.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks to all of you for being here. I'm grateful to Richard Bailey and to everyone here for inviting me. I'm honored to be part of this tradition of the Fitzpatrick Lectures. I'm going to talk to you for about 50 minutes or so on the topic of Appalachia, where I'm from, in case you didn't figure that out by my accent. I'll be delving into the complications of Appalachia, including the way my own love for it is complicated. In my travels around the world, I found that there are many misconceptions about the place. And the main reason for this is lack of context. So I hope to offer you some of that tonight. Most people's experience with Appalachia comes from visual media that is usually offered with very little explanation. I'm going to explain some of that. I'm going to tell you my own story of being an Appalachian and being a multifaceted person. But before I do all of that, I want to give you my definition of Appalachia. Some of you may already have a good understanding of the place and its culture, while some of you may have no idea what Appalachia is. For the most part, I'm going to talk about the way I define Appalachia. So please keep in mind that there are many definitions. Appalachia is a difficult thing to define, and it's made harder to define because most everyone either has no idea what it is or has an idea of the place based completely on stereotypes perpetuated by popular media over the last 150 years. So first of all, I need you to know that some people think of Appalachia as referring to anywhere within the Appalachian mountain range. And so with that in mind, you are in Appalachia to some degree here. Appalachia runs from southern Canada to northern Alabama. The mountain range is at least 480 million years old. It's one of the oldest in the world. The mountains look mostly like this in Appalachia. This is the Smoky Mountains, which is probably the most visited part of Appalachia because it's the most visited national park in the country. So that is what Appalachia is topographically. But the government has a definition of Appalachia too, because they need it to specify particular funding, grant applications, the census, things of that nature. This map is arguable, with some parts of it seeming to reach too far and other parts of it seeming like they should be included but are not. But anywhere within these borders is the government's definition. The most important definition to me is a cultural one. So for that one, I'm going to show you the area where most people often identify as Appalachian, the area from which Appalachian literature and media originates, and where the media usually considers Appalachia. This is where the definition gets blurry because some of this is about self-identity, but it's also about history, economy, government, disenfranchisement, foodways, craft traditions, dialects, agricultural ways, religion, and much more. As you see, we're already getting to some of the complications by merely defining it. When we talk about Appalachian culture, many people picture images like these, which are the standard stereotypes of Appalachian people that have been fostered by popular media for at least 150 years. And if we had more time, I could give you the entire history of stereotyping the Appalachian people. But in brief, I'll tell you that the main stereotype is that we are all white, cis, straight, and Christian, and that we are violent, lazy, addicted, incestuous, over-sexualized, poor, toothless, asexual, more. There are contradictions involved in these stereotypes. When people think of Appalachia, they think of things like moonshine, racing, violence, especially deliverance, or worst of all, incest. But Appalachia is actually made up of many different ways of being and many different kinds of people, most of whom you would not expect. Incredible talents and activists like Nina Simone. And I want to play just a snippet of Nina Simone because I want to share her anytime that I'm able to. And I'm playing that mostly because that's not what people think of when they think of Appalachia or when they think about an Appalachian musician, certainly. And it often surprises my students when I teach Nina Simone in my Appalachian media class, because they have been taught that Appalachians only make music like this. Or this. There's the deliverance theme. And The Simpsons has its own hillbilly. His name is Cletus. This is his theme song. But Appalachians tend to sound more like a real Appalachian, like Jason Isbell, who you might know. So there are many different ways to sound and be Appalachian. Also on here, there's the drag legend Eureka. They're at the bottom. And then there at the top is the widow Combs, who is one of the people responsible for the modern environmental justice movement. She laid down in front of bulldozers in front of Appalachia in 1964 and kick-started the protest against strip mining and later mountaintop removal. So while most Americans would picture an Appalachian family looking like this is obviously people in a Halloween outfits. This is considered an Appalachian family, but this is my Appalachian family. In this picture are teachers, professors, writers, a horticulturist, a digital artist. They're all Appalachian. They're human beings who are complex people, not simple stereotypes. In truth, Appalachian culture is actually a braid of 3 distinct root cultures that became entangled in the late 18th century: Native American culture, Scots-Irish culture, and African culture. This is obvious in many facets of Appalachian life, whether it be our music, our agricultural systems, our vernacular, our foodways, our craft traditions, and many other obvious ways. Now, one other note I should offer before I move on is that the name of the place itself is a source of complication. People who live in the northern parts of Appalachia, like here, tend to call it Appalachia, while people who live in the southern parts of central Appalachia almost unanimously call it Appalachia. People in the southern and central parts who pronounce it Appalachia tend to take this pretty seriously. There's a whole industry that revolves around this with t-shirts, caps, bumper stickers, and more in shops across the region. This is one way that people can tell where you are from in this complicated place. If you know anything about the history of Ireland and the Troubles, it might help you to know that this different pronunciation is somewhat akin to the way that those who were fine with the United Kingdom claiming part of Ireland refer to that part as Northern Ireland, while Irish people from the Republic who believe in unification refer to that section as the North of Ireland. This denotes something important for the people living there, just as the pronunciation of either Appalachia or Appalachia does for the people who live there. And by the way, I think people should pronounce it however they want to. And when in Rome, do as the Romans do. My mouth doesn't move very naturally around Appalachia. It's really hard for me to say that. A Southern Appalachian mouth moves more naturally around the word Appalachia. Appalachia is quite divided on lots of fronts, although the idea is that it's a monolith. So just so we're clear on that, I want to clarify that I mean a monolith being a large and impersonal political, corporate, or social structure regarded as intractably indivisible and uniform. Appalachia is a place of many ways of being, many dialects and vernaculars, many foodways, many different customs. It's a place that is both polluted and pristine, sometimes in the same place, as you can see in this remarkable picture by one of my favorite photographers of the region, Roger May, where you can see on one side the pollution coming down one creek and the pristine creek coming down the other side and at that confluence. I hope you'll look up the work of Roger May. Appalachia is a place that contains multitudes. For the 2018 Hulu documentary, Hillbilly, I wrote these lines, and I stand by them today. Appalachia is a wound and a joy and a poem, a knot of complication. But you cannot know a place without loving it and hating it and feeling everything in between. Appalachia is certainly not a monolith, as I've established, but we are unified in one major way. Appalachia as a whole is a place that is roundly stereotyped, mocked, and even openly hated by many people in this country. Hopefully, You already have a deeper understanding of Appalachia just based on that. When I teach my Appalachian studies classes, I have one objective for my students, which I tell them on the first day of class. I have a similar goal for this talk. Once you leave here, if you get into a conversation about Appalachia, I want you to be the expert in that conversation. And I want you to provide the context that is so often missing from conversations about the culture and the place. Most of all, I want you to win any argument about Appalachia that you may find yourself in. So with all of that out of the way, I want to begin today and in fact frame the entire speech with a poem I wrote a few years ago. I thought it particularly appropriate to start off my speech with this poem because it was published in the definitive magazine of the region, the Appalachian Review. And I'm going to read the poem and then I'll spend the next few minutes explaining it and expanding on its themes. The poem is called Double Creek Girl. They don't expect much out of girls raised on Double Creek. Up where the pines hang low over the road like a tunnel and the sun doesn't rise until the rest of the world has had its coffee and forgotten the magic of morning already. Up where evening mist breathes over the clean graveyard and gardens with the straight rows, they don't think girls from a place like Double Creek will amount to anything at all, especially when you were little and they had pictures of girls like you in all the magazines, Life and Look and Time. Once a man from National Geographic came and took pictures up there. Girls in dresses their mothers made them and stringy hair, hollow-eyed, hungry-eyed, sad-eyed. But you defied them, Double Creek girl. You showed them. Every time you opened a book and drank it up like spring water. Each time you read a poem and closed your eyes at the end, savoring it like a good hunk of cornbread, seeing it like an azure sky, tasting the words like the wet in a bloom of honeysuckle. You showed them when you listened to every word the teacher said and walked that commencement line and took your degree from the hand of the professor who was secretly one of them. He never thought you could do it, but you did. See here, our Appalachia, our bone and blood. Listen, our Double Creek girl, you are what happens when we know that God lives in between the pages of books and at the tips of pencils and on the sharp edges of notebook paper. That's something they'll never know. So this poem to me is about overcoming the odds. It's about people underestimating someone because they're from a poor place, a rural place, an Appalachian place. But it's also a true story. I wrote this poem about a friend of mine who is a high school teacher. She's one of the best teachers I've known. She always goes the extra mile. She's excited about education and she makes her students excited about it. She loves books and words and knowledge. Lots of people wouldn't have expected her to turn out that way because she's from a tiny, rural, poverty-stricken place, Double Creek in Clay County, Kentucky, which sits very near the epicenter of Appalachia. Her family did not have money, and there were a whole lot of them. In 1971, when the girl in the poem was a child, National Geographic, a magazine known for doing massive pictorials in third world countries, thought Double Creek so exotic and isolated that they came there and did a pictorial spread and a long article about it. This is one of the photographs which I looked at while I was writing the poem. Other pictures show the one-room schoolhouse in Double Creek, populated by students who are required to not only learn, but also to keep their school clean. The school's closest thing to a lunchroom was a leaky refrigerator in the back of the room, which held the students' lunches they had brought from home. The playground was nothing more than a field by the creek. Truth be told, the school was at least 30 years behind the rest of the country. Later, I'll give you context on why Appalachian schools remain behind to this day. Double Creek wasn't exactly a school that the colleges were beating at the door to get their students. Students from Double Creek had to work incredibly hard to get into a good college. And once there, they found that they had to work even harder to make some of the professors take them seriously because of where they were from, because of how they talked, because of who their people were. The girl in the poem overcomes the odds that are against her because she believes in herself. This is not just an Appalachian story. This is a story for many Americans. She has to come to believe in herself through reading poetry and books and being in touch with nature. She knows that education is the way to rise up. I knew this too. But first, I want to give you some context on education in Appalachia, and then I'll get into my own Appalachian story. For this part, I need to take you all the way back to Reconstruction, the period of rebuilding the Union after the Civil War, illustrated by this advertisement of the period that gives a hint of how problematic the period would be, with the wealthy planter shaking the hand of the government while the working folks are relegated to the background. It also perfectly illustrates the context I want to give you about education in Appalachia. The stereotype of Appalachian people is that we're dumb simply because we're genetically inferior. In fact, we have so long and widely been thought of as genetically inferior that sterilization and eugenics programs have been seriously considered for Appalachian people as recently as the late 1970s. When one of Kentucky's leading political and literary voices, Harry Caudill, began to read William Shockley's dysgenics theory, which is the theory that Appalachian people, which is the theory that an intelligent people weaken the genes of race over time. The stereotype is that we are just too lazy and stupid to learn. The stereotype is that these people are far more illiterate than other Americans. But statistics provided by a study done just this year show that only 2 Appalachian states show up in the top 10 most illiterate states. So during the Civil War, the Appalachian sections of Confederate and border states remained overwhelmingly loyal to the Union. This is not because Appalachians are more moral people, but because slavery was not as widespread in the mountainous areas due to the topography not being agreeable with large-scale agricultural operations. Thus, the issue of slavery was not as important to Appalachian people. And in border states like Kentucky and the newly formed West Virginia, parts of Tennessee and North Carolina, people largely signed up with the Union. In seceded states where men were forced to fight for the Confederacy, the people back home largely remained true to the Union and sometimes helped Union forces. During Reconstruction, who comes back into control in these once border and Confederate states? The wealthy landowner. Once they were back in control of the government, they wanted to punish Union loyalists, and the best way to do this was to withhold infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and especially education. The best way to control people is to keep them uneducated. Far more funding was sent to cities that housed the wealthy landowners who had recently been slave owners than went to mountainous regions where there were people who not only didn't own slaves, but also had no power in state government. Appalachia is still seeing the ramifications of this punishment more than 150 years later. It was certainly seeing the ramifications more when my grandparents were in school in the first decade of the 20th century. And even in the 1950s and 60s when my parents were in school. And this is one reason I was the first college graduate in my family. It's important to note here that this holding back of the region continued for the next 150 years at the behest of corporations. It was easier to control people living in the natural resources rich area if they could be kept from their education and their infrastructure. It was easier to convince them that extraction was the only way forward. No matter where you go in the world that has natural resources, whether it's Appalachia or Nigeria or Saudi Arabia, you will find corporations that not only stereotype the people, but also hold back their educational systems to more easily control them and to keep them chained to extraction. But I want to go back to my parents. My parents were raised in the kind of poverty that people always associate with Appalachia. My paternal grandmother raised my father along with 8 other children as a single mother after her husband died shortly after her 9th child was born. All of the children were members of the workforce by the time they were 14 years old. My father, hoping to escape a life in the coal mines or being forced to move north like some of his siblings, joined the military. 2 years later, he found himself in the jungles of Vietnam. My mother was orphaned at the age of 9 and was raised by a first cousin. She never had a birthday cake until she was a grown woman. From the moment they met, my parents have never been apart. And part of the thing that unified them was their experience with poverty. This is them in 1971 when my mother was pregnant with me. They found in each other kindred spirits who believed that if they worked hard, they could rise up out of the poverty they had been born into and make a better life for their child. So they did. My father was a mechanic for most of my childhood, and my mother worked in the school cafeteria. We lived in a little red trailer on the banks of Robinson Creek, and I had a wonderful childhood with parents who adored me. I grew up in a town of about 500 people, where most of us were the same class, which was lower middle class. I was surrounded by cousins and neighbors who felt like kin. Our local school was the center of the community, where lots of people in the community attended ball games, dances, and talent shows. You can see one picture of me there at a square dance at our local school. I grew up outside playing in the woods, fishing, swimming, always with my cousins. And we were always proud, raised to be proud of where we were from, to believe that we should stay where we were from, and to know that family was the most important thing above all else. Where I'm from, the world is very evenly divided between the people who go to church fervently and the people who do not. Around the time I was about 5 years old, both of my parents started going to church fervently. That is my mother getting baptized. We went to a very strict holiness church, and most everything revolved around it. In the middle, I'm preparing to ride the church parade in a local festival. And the other picture is an Easter egg hunt. That's me beside the older lady. I'm wearing a little mint green suit with a green bow tie. In the church, I felt incredibly loved, and it wouldn't be until I was a teenager that I would begin to question some of what I was hearing from the pulpit. Those are the moments when my love for Appalachia first began to turn complicated, but more on that later. I think going to church so much and so fervently is one of the main reasons I'm a writer. Church services sometimes lasted 3 or 4 hours, and often we went 3 or 4 times a week. I wasn't allowed to take toys with me, but I was allowed to take a little notebook and pencil. I survived those long church services by drawing, or more often by writing little stories. Another thing that made me a writer was that my Aunt Dot ran the community store, Dot's Grocery, where I often was able to fade into the background to eavesdrop on the stories that everyone told when they came in. People didn't just go into Dot's and get their groceries and leave. They sat and visited and gossiped. They told stories, they told secrets. I listened, I watched, like writers do even before they know they're writers. I was a glutton for secrets. Somewhere I was filing away how to tell a story, how to build suspense, how to create characters. I think I first learned all of that at Dot's Grocery. And today I mourn the loss of small community stores like these that were the centers a rural life back then. As my parents worked harder and harder, we moved up in the world. Eventually, by the time I was about 10 years old, settling in a 5-room house at the foot of Slate Ridge. We had a carport and a fireplace. We had 3 pink dogwoods in the yard. My parents felt as if they had achieved the American dream, and they were doing everything in their power to hope I would too. Even though I came from a county famous basketball family, I had very little athletic talent, but I loved to read. I spent all of my free time devouring books. This is me in about the 6th grade, I believe. Some of the first books that I devoured were these stories about dogs, about being an outsider, about rural people. When I was in 7th grade, my favorite teacher gave me a copy of this book, and it was a life changer, as it has been for many people. By 9th grade, I had found this one, which completely blew my mind open. No other book has transformed me as much as The Color Purple. I began to write all the time. I wrote dozens of short stories. Here I am on my first electric typewriter, which really dates me. I wanted to be the next John Boy Walton. Only some of you will know who John Boy is. For those of you too young to know, John Boy was a character on a widely watched television show. I thought I had the theme song handy, but I don't. John Boy he made me feel less alone because he was a country boy who wanted to be a writer. He was certainly the only other boy I knew who wanted to be a writer, who would even admit that they read. And he was an Appalachian boy from the mountains not too far from where I was from. He was a character that first made me think that I too could become a writer in a world that was constantly telling me that rural people were just illiterate and stupid and worthless. The Waltons was the rare positive representation of rural people and Appalachians in a world increasingly negating anyone who was not urban. The older I got, the more multifaceted I fancied myself to be. I became the editor of my high school and then college newspaper when I won a journalism scholarship to a prestigious journalism program. I sometimes code switched and went hunting with my cousins just to spend time with them, but I would secretly just lean against a tree and read a book I had slipped into my pocket. I also smoked to fit in with them. That was the stupidest thing I ever did. More and more, I was finding literature that was set where I was from and that was making me feel like I was finding a community. Some of these books were books like The Doll Maker, one of the greatest American novels ever written, River of Earth, and the works of Lee Smith, who was from very near where I was from, and her books were really transformative for me. But none of the books were set in contemporary rural America. So I kept writing. At the same time, I was working in restaurants, first at a fast food chain and later at a steakhouse. The work was hard, but I made great friends. Along with them and my cousins, I started partying really hard because when you're from a place that has such strict divisions that you either have to be totally married to the church or not, the result is if you're not, you go wild. So I went wild and I partied all the time. I left the church in protest of the constant homophobia and xenophobia and misogyny that I was witnessing in the pulpit. During this time, I was also seeing fellow Appalachians from right where I was from becoming hugely famous and being representatives of the place I was from and positive representatives. These were people who were famous all over the world. And they all made a point of talking about their Appalachian roots and of rejecting the notion that Appalachians had to be associated with the past. They showed that Appalachians could be contemporary people who had contemporary ways of thinking and even contemporary clothing. They refused to wear the hillbilly costume. These caricatures, so often found in popular media, gave people all over the world that all Appalachians were these stupid, lazy, violent moonshiners who didn't do anything but lie around on their porches, make moonshine, participate in feuds. I encountered many of these stereotypes when I entered college, only an hour away from home. Here I am around that time with a beautiful U2 poster in the background. I wish I still had that poster. I especially wish I still had that shirt. If I did, I couldn't fit into it. But there at university, for the first time, I spent time with people from all over the world. And I had a lot of assumptions about them that were dispelled. And they had a lot of assumptions about me that I hope I dispelled. The movies had taught them that everyone from my place in the world was racist, homophobic, sexist, xenophobic. So lots of people wouldn't talk to me because of this. Others openly made fun of the way I talked to my face. Many people think it's okay to make fun of rural people and rural accents because they associate these with poverty. It made me mad, but it also made me more determined than ever to prove them all wrong. And the best way I knew to fight back was to write. Shortly after I graduated from college, I published my first short story in this magazine. And during this time, I was also working on what would become my first novel. In what would become Clay's Quilt, I was taking all the elements that I've been telling you about thus far. Growing up in the church, growing up in a storytelling culture, in a community store, growing up among cousins and friends, growing up with a dedication honoring my people and my culture, growing up in a place of intense natural beauty. This is our Niagara. It's called Cumberland Falls. It's actually called the Niagara of the South, and it's very near where I grew up. So I had to get that into this specific talk. I was also working in partying and working and many other elements. I was in an algebra class my sophomore year in college when I wrote the first line of my first book. It went like this. They were in a car going over Buffalo Mountain, but the man driving was not Clay's father. Now, there are a lot of things I wish I could change about my first novel. I would get rid of most of the adverbs, for one thing. But the thing I would never change is that this is a really great opening line, and I've loved it ever since I first wrote it. Many, many times I have been in a car going over Buffalo Mountain. And honestly, I knew a lot of people, mostly people I was kin to, who were often with some other man besides their father, namely their mother's boyfriends or new husbands. So right away, I was in a world I knew well. And those two themes go on throughout the book. The issue of men who are good fathers and bad fathers, the men who disappear as fathers, and the issues of place. And it's right there in the first line. I knew right away that one thing I really wanted to do was take the reader to the Appalachia that I knew, because most people do not understand the place. I was really stunned when I went to college and began to encounter people from outside the region who had these misconceptions about me. They assumed, for instance, that I only listen to bluegrass music, like I played you earlier, when in fact, in my early 20s, I was listening to records like these. They assumed that I came from a place that didn't value artistry, but everyone I knew encouraged me to be a writer. I'm going to put a picture of my Aunt Sis up here because to me, she is my Appalachia. She is the person who bought me my first books, my first guitar, my first typewriter. When people insult me about being from Appalachia, I never think about myself. I always think about Sis, and I always see her face come up before me. Therefore, I'm much more insulted and attacked because I feel like she's being attacked and not me. When those people insult me, really they're assuming that I come from a place that's not part of the modern world. But everyone I knew, including Sis, watched MTV. She was in her 60s when she introduced me to AC/DC and Prince and Janet Jackson. They assumed I came from a place where nobody wore shoes, where I was the only one who could read and write. Most troubling to me, they assumed I came from a place that was simple, and there's nothing simple about Appalachia. When I went to find books about my own generation's experience in the place, they were not there. So I wrote the book that I wanted to read. And although I didn't know it at the time, I wrote the first novel about Generation X Appalachians. And then the book came out, and nobody was more surprised than me when it became a New York Times bestseller. I had thought that a few people in the region might read it, so I was stunned when it began to be read throughout the country, when I received letters from England and India and everywhere in between. 8 months after it was published, I was able to quit my job as a mail carrier and become a full-time writer. Here's the current cover. It's in its 20th anniversary edition, and it's never been out of print. I did not know that Appalachian writers have a special responsibility to represent their place. When most writers go on book tours, they only talk about their books. When Appalachian writers go on book tour, we spend a lot of time talking about Appalachia. And I'm always glad to do that because people want to understand the region better. I try to answer the questions the best I can, but mostly what I have to say about the place is contained in my books. I feel like I articulate it better within the novels, and I mostly want people to go there to get my perspective. However, sometimes I am asked to give talks like this, and I'm always honored to be representing my place the best way I can. I do think that my career has been held back because I'm pigeonholed as an Appalachian writer. There are some gigs that just will not call on rural writers, working class writers, Appalachian writers. There are some literary circles who think we're inferior. There are some reviewers who will always give a complex portrayal of the region a bad review, and will always give a simplistic portrayal of the region a glowing review. This only makes me want to tell the stories more. And it solidifies what I was taught my whole life, that we have to fight back. And I'm only able to fight back through words. I think that true Appalachian writers are writing because they're trying to understand the place too, because there's nowhere more complicated, more complex, or more interesting to me because it's where I'm from. I also often find the region frustrating and problematic. It is not a completely good place, nor is it a completely bad place, because no place is. It's complex, and that complexity is the main thing lacking from stereotype. I've encountered a lot of them in my 20 years as a writer. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit here. One of my favorite writers, Zora Neale Hurston, had to overcome many more discriminatory obstacles than I have had to. She lived in Jim Crow America when a Black woman had very few rights, and the rights she did have were often taken from her. She was the first Black woman in the world to attempt to become a full-time writer, and she succeeded. She wrote American masterpieces, chief among them, one of my favorites, Their Eyes Were Watching God. She had several strikes against her, though. Not only was she a Black woman in a time perhaps even more racist than her own, she was also a woman in a time when women had far fewer rights. She had no money for most of her life, and certainly not when she was beginning in the world of writing. She was from the rural South, and her speech betrayed that. In her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, Zora talks at length about the racism she faced, but she also writes about the classism she faced, and that was all based on the way she talked. She was particularly affected by those prejudices as a young college student in New York City. In her biography of Zora, Wrapped in Rainbows, Valerie Boyd writes, because of her class and race, some of her classmates laughed at her, thinking it ridiculous that a Black and Southern woman should be trying to get a college education. But Zora looked at it this way. I knew getting mad would not help any, she once wrote. I had to get my lessons so well that their laughter would seem silly. In other words, she was not about to let anyone get her down. Another one of my favorite people was a contemporary of Zora Neale Hurston's, Eleanor Roosevelt. In the 7th grade, I encountered a quote from her that has changed my life, and I mention it in almost every talk I give. No one can make you inferior without your consent. So you may wonder why I'm talking about Zora Neale Hurston and Eleanor Roosevelt in a presentation about Appalachia. I'm not comparing my experience to theirs, but I want to illustrate what a universal story the Appalachian story is. Anyone who's ever been negated, erased, held back can relate to it. I told you earlier that for most of my childhood, we lived in a 2-bedroom trailer that sat on the banks of a creek. Almost everyone in my family lived in trailers. I never thought anything of this until one evening when I was playing out front of my aunt's trailer in the hottest part of summer. I probably looked something like this that day because I was around this age and I was always with a dog in those days. I still am. And the car certainly puts us in the time period. We should have a little bit of music to put us in the time period too. Or all of those ring bells. Such great music. So I was 10 and I was playing Star Wars with my cousin in the yard. I was Luke Skywalker. He was Darth Vader. We were fighting to the death with our plastic lightsabers. We were both barefoot because it was summertime and we were children and we loved the feel of the grass under our feet, not because we didn't have shoes. And then a car went by and laid on its horn, causing us to look up. There was a man in his late 20s probably who was hanging halfway out of the car's windows. He cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled out, "Trailer trash!" He was talking to us. It didn't matter that my aunt worked every night on the 3rd shift at the yarn factory and that her freshly mown yard was meticulous, that her porch was always populated by solid furniture and bright geraniums and hanging pots of luscious fuchsia. It didn't matter that we were human beings who were just trying to get by the best we could, who had joys and sorrows like everyone else. To this car passing by, we were trash because we lived in trailers in a rural little town where nothing much ever happened. Recently, for this talk, I Googled the phrase. Here are some of the less vulgar images that came up. There's a theme. There are actually trailer trash parties that happen where people dress up like this and go and they, eat foods that they think what people who live in trailers would eat and things of that nature. One of the things that came up was trailer trash Barbie. She's a doll pushing a baby carriage containing 3 infants while she smokes cigarettes and drinks beer. She's pregnant again, of course. Her mascara is smudged. She carries a box of macaroni and cheese in her purse, along with a 5th of Jack Daniels and cigarettes. This is the way lots of people think of those who inhabit not only trailers, but also rural places, anybody who is poor, all variations on stereotypes of the poor. But my people don't look anything like this. We certainly don't wear these sorts of costumes. My people are not trash. They're human beings. They're my people. Being called trailer trash was a defining moment for me. Those 2 words hit me in the gut, not so much because they were directed at me, but because they were directed at everyone I knew and loved. My people have been reduced to one ugly phrase, a phrase that exists only, solely to do harm. Many people's definitions of Appalachian or rural American is the same as their definition of trailer trash because the words Appalachia and rural are synonymous with the word poverty. And that's why so many people are activated by the accent because it sounds like poverty to them. To many Americans, there is nothing lower than an Appalachian person because the thinking is that everyone there has had the same opportunities to rise up as everyone else in the country. As scholar Barbara Billings says, people think of Appalachia as nothing but trash and trashy people, so why not trash it? This kind of thinking has allowed corporations to devastate the region largely without any checking. In 2005, a 1-ton boulder was dislodged on a coal mine site. It crashed down the mountain and through the exterior of a trailer, a mobile home, then 2 interior walls before coming to rest atop a 3-year-old child, killing him. His name was Jeremy Davidson. There was not a single national headline about this incident. Most of you have probably heard of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. If you were alive in 1989, you certainly heard about it. But I would bet that most of you have not heard of the year 2000 Martin County sludge spill. In October of 2000, 306 million gallons of toxic sludge were released into the waterways of eastern Kentucky. The spill was 30 times larger than the Exxon Valdez oil spill, yet it barely made a blip on the national headlines. The region is just trash, so why not trash it? This way of thinking has allowed extractors to devastate the region and to limit the opportunities afforded to Appalachian people. It's important to note that Appalachia was not always poor. The region only became poverty-stricken after the advent of timber, oil, gas, and coal extraction. Before extraction, Appalachian people were self-sustaining, living on their own farms in a bartering society. Appalachia is a place rich in natural resources that has seen almost all of that wealth leave the region because the land, as well as timber and mineral rights, have historically been owned by people outside the region. In short, we are poorer because our wealth has been stripped from us, literally and figuratively. Another stereotype that's associated with Appalachia is that everyone is addicted to drugs simply because we're genetically inferior, lazy, stupid. The truth is much more complicated. When you have the context for the drug epidemics that have hit Appalachia, you will know that pharmaceutical companies have long targeted the region due to 3 major reasons: lack of easy access to medical care, proliferation of labor-intensive jobs that cause bodily harm, higher depression rates, partly due to fewer economic opportunities and access to mental health care. This was all beautifully reported in the brilliant book, Dope Sick by Beth Macy, which I hope you might read if you're interested in more context about how the drug epidemic has devastated rural areas, and in the subsequent miniseries based on the book. Recently, Barbara Kingsolver's huge bestseller, Demon Copperhead, has told this story to an even larger audience. I have saved the most complicated part of my look at the complications of Appalachia to the very last because it is the most difficult part to talk about and to understand. It's the part that hurts me the deepest. I'll ease into it by returning briefly to my own Appalachian story. Once I graduated from college, after some time in a variety of terrible jobs, I entered academia and encountered my own set of prejudices there because I refused to change my accent and because of where I'm from and the cultural implications of that. I believe as long as you have excellent grammar, which I do, I have to brag, your accent need not be affected. I have always strived to have good grammar. One of my first teaching jobs was in a large city on the blurred border of the North and the South. I was very happy to have that job, But then a friend of mine told me that a colleague at the university had warned her to be leery of me. He's from the mountains, she said. They're all racist and homophobic and misogynistic down there. Well, I know a lot of racist, homophobic, misogynists, but no more of them are from the mountains than from any other part of the world. Racist, homophobic, misogynists exist everywhere. And when we put them all in Appalachia or the South, we're letting the rest of the country off the hook. So here we get into the complicated love. We're going to be discussing some ugly, awful things for the next couple of minutes. So I found something beautiful for us to look at while I talk about that. You Pedro Pascal fans will appreciate that, but I'm going to put something more appropriate for the talk up. Because the truth is that when you look at the way the region as a whole votes, the region does vote for politicians who uphold and introduce bigoted legislation that is harmful to the environment and women, the kind of legislation that is so racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, and xenophobic that it does make it seem like the region as a whole is more on board with those things. The people I know individually in Appalachia are not this way, but we cannot overlook the fact that the region has overwhelmingly voted this way for a couple of decades now. As a novelist, I often travel the country and even the world to talk about my books. During those events, almost invariably, someone will ask me why my home state of Kentucky is so conservative and why we've kept Mitch McConnell in office for almost 40 years. They take their anger at him out on me. Once a fellow writer told me I shouldn't be invited to a literary conference because of my state's complicity in McConnell's obstructionism during Obama's presidency. Aren't you ashamed to be a Kentuckian, an Appalachian? He asked. Spittle actually flew from his lips. I couldn't blame him for his anger. I can't blame people for hating McConnell, honestly. Hardly anyone has done more to impede our democracy over the last 40 years than he has. Appalachia is now known as Trump country. This is a derogatory term used to simplify a place. The main problem with the term is that it allows the rest of the world to assume that everyone in the place votes the same way. Witness this passage from Kevin Baker writing in the New Republic. Quote, "The people of Trump country, like so much of white America, long for the past that never was and a future that cannot be. A past cleansed of conflict, where a big paternalistic company gave them nice things if they worked hard." So there's truth in that. But the problem is he is reducing all people in one place to aligning themselves with that sort of thought. And it's just not true. From the environmental ravages of the coal industry to the potential social cost of a Trump administration, Trump country has allowed itself to be reduced, according to Baker. Yet he is the one reducing everyone in the region by easily defined stereotypes. While the majority of Appalachian people do vote for extreme conservatism right now, the fact is that there are many people who live in the region who are fighting the good fight for progressive policy. There are a legion of grassroots organizations that are doing the work that representatives ought to be doing. Still, this is the part I dreaded talking about. I left Appalachia in 2019. Around 2015, I started to see it changing drastically, and the vitriol increased more and more. The most hateful among us have been empowered by those in the highest places of power who belittled, negated, and vilified the disabled, trans people, Black people, immigrants, gay people, academics, most anyone who wasn't the kind of Christian they wanted them to be, and just about anyone who wasn't just like him and his base. I'm not here to say that Appalachia is more bigoted than other parts of the country, because I do not believe it is. But I'm here to tell you that witnessing the rise of this bigotry in my home place hurts me worse because it's my home place. It's the place I should feel most welcome and most safe, but it's not. I cannot deny that the vast majority of people there are voting for this kind of legislation. It is true that large swaths of Appalachia are gerrymandered to fare thee well. It is true that they are ruled by the local elite, a campaign of misinformation and outside money from people like the Koch brothers, who benefit from conservative legislation and keeping Americans divided by fear tactics. Yet my love for Appalachia is complicated when I no longer feel safe or welcome there. For me, it is even more about feeling welcomed than it is about feeling safe. Just this week, a gay couple was attacked by 4 men in New York City's Times Square for holding hands, one of the most diverse places in the world, supposedly one of the more welcoming places in the world. So imagine how it feels to be one half of a gay couple in rural Kentucky, a state where 9 anti-LGBTQ bills were recently published, with one considered the most anti-trans legislation in the country passing into law. My love is complicated for a place that I feel does not love me back for being who I am completely, whether that place is Appalachia or America. Which brings me to what is perhaps my main point of this talk. Appalachia is and always has been a microcosm of America. The values of Appalachia, both good and bad, are by and large the values of America. Just as Appalachia has seemed to turn more conservative and bigoted and vitriolic, so has the rest of the country. When we left Appalachia 3 years ago, we didn't go too far. My husband and I live about 90 miles from where we grew up in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky, pictured here. We now live in the blue oasis of Lexington, where pride flags and Black Lives Matter signs hang in the windows of many businesses, where you can hear a dozen different languages and dialects while strolling through the farmer's market. We feel welcomed and safer in Lexington, yet we can drive only a few minutes before we see the misty blue mountains in the distance. There's a place on the road where I always feel a little pang upon seeing the ridges I still call home, even if I know I can never live there again. I'm always homesick for a place that no longer exists for me, a place of complete love and acceptance that really hasn't existed since I was a little boy and didn't know any better. But when we come to the certain bend in the road where I can see those mountains, the homesickness grows larger even as we are headed toward our old home. Homesickness, like grief, is unexpressed love. But my homesickness is thicker because it's also time sickness, a longing for the past as much as for a place. My love for Appalachia is complicated because I understand its faults and its limitations, even as I realize its beauty, its power, the dignity possessed by most of its people, the love I feel from so many of its people. So my hope tonight is that your thoughts on Appalachia have become more complicated too. My agenda has not been for you to love it or to hate it, but only for you to think of it as a more complicated place, full of complex people who have joys and sorrows, just like all Americans. Thank you. I couldn't completely hear back here. I don't know if you pointed out there are mics. If you want the mic, if you have a question, if you don't feel loud enough, you can go to the mic. But I do hope that you'll talk to me. I came a long way, so I hope that we can have a conversation. That's my favorite part of these things. So does anybody have a question? Don't be bashful.
Gone. Thank you for this great talk, Silas. I also grew up alongside a creek, and I've come to call nature, I think we call nature like it's something outside of ourselves, but I've come to understand that we as humans are nature too. And so maybe I call it the natural world. And it comes through like in the picture behind you, and it's beautiful. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts to share for us in your writing, and like how you said, how you use words. Growing alongside the flowing waters that go up and over and around these mountains. How does that influence your writing?
That's a great question. I I always need a body of water, and um, when we moved, we found a house that was on a creek, and I'm like, this is the house. If I'm going to live in the city, which I didn't want to do, I have to be on a creek. And so now I'm able to be by that creek every day. And there's just something about water that has always spoken to me. I mean, I guess it's just primal, in a way, but it is something that I always go to. But I do think that Appalachian people have a connection to water, a strange connection to water. There's so many waterways when you live in mountains, it's drainage. So of course there's a lot of water around. And one thing that I didn't mention in my talk that was really formative to me was when I was 12 years old, I came out onto my porch one morning, and the ridge that was right in front of our house that doesn't look too dissimilar from this, just not as mountainous as that. There's a creek that ran through it, and that's where we would go sledding in the winter, and we played in those woods all the time. And then one morning there were several bulldozers on that ridge, and then over the course of the next week the ridge was gone. And it just was so it changed everything for me to grow up across from a strip mine. And what made that more complicated was that I was from a family of coal miners. And so on one hand, my family had risen up out of poverty due to coal, but here I was seeing my community destroyed. There's blasting all the time, and there was dust, and our road was destroyed, and taxpayers had to pay for all of that. The coal company, once they got the coal, they filed bankruptcy, and then they didn't have to reclaim it because of the bankruptcy, which is something that often happens. So I think it gave me a real sense of injustice, which serves you well as a writer, to have that trouble. But it just made me aware from a very young age of how endangered the natural world always is in our country. And I guess in most of the world, as technology grows stronger and more able to just decimate a mountain completely. And certainly the water has been affected by that. It just boggles my mind, when I see people, like every year in Kentucky, we march on the Capitol to protect our waterways. And that's dystopian. Yeah, of all things, we should always protect our water, but water is life. How could we ever endanger our water? It doesn't make any sense. What else? I won't make you go to the mic if you're not comfortable doing that. Just speak loud and I'll repeat it back. Oh, this is a tourist attraction. I didn't even notice it was in. This is called the Chained Rock, and it was. You go way up on this mountain, and this huge rock that's sort of hanging out of the mountain is chained to the mountain. And so the old legend is if the rock hadn't been chained, that it would have fallen off and crushed the town. But they chained it and they kept it there in case it ever falls, it'll swing from the mountain. It's just it was an old way to get tourists in to buy postcards. Yeah. This is Pine Mountain. Yes.
Okay. So, wow, so loud. So I wonder how you reconcile the authenticity of local dialect with the way in which it might be received and perceived by outside audiences. So like, how do you uplift a dialect that has been disparaged by so many people? And like, what's that process like for you as a writer from that region?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think if you look at my books, the way that I get across dialect is the thing that I have improved the most, that I've learned how to do it over the course of time. There's a lot more phonetic delivery of dialect in my early work versus now where I try to get it across more through vernacular words and syntax. Because what happens is if you try to capture a dialect phonetically, let's say in my family, in my culture, to build a fire, F-I-R-E, a natural way in my family to say that would be, I'll build a fire. So if I spell that out, the character says that in my book and it's spelled out F-A-R, what comes across to our brains as readers is that that character doesn't know how to spell the word fire. You know, it's just the way that it reads. And so you have to find other ways to conjure the sound of the dialect. And so, like I said, I've learned to do that by weaving vernacular words in throughout. And our syntax is particular as well. And just occasionally, doing that. Not too long ago, a young woman approached me in a bookstore and she said, I really wanted to read your latest book, but like on the third page, somebody says, I reckon. And I just threw it down. I'm like, I'm not going to read that. And I was sort of stunned. I said, reckon is a beautiful word. Why would you not? And she says, it's just too countrified. It just sounds so stupid. And so a friend of mine, when I told the story, she said, I wonder how she feels when a British person uses reckon. Because I think when we would hear a British person, we would think that would sound very elegant, Another thing we use a lot in Appalachian culture is instead of at all, we will say at all. And that's something, again, that British people often will say, that can join those two words. When we say it, it sounds kind of backwards and people think it sounds ignorant, but a British person with that, beautiful accent, it sounds differently. So I think the answer is you just have to think about it very carefully and work on it and fine tune it. And I wish that we captured more of the dialects of the United States. I think people tend to think that in American literature, there's only like Southern dialect, but people like Elizabeth Strout, for instance, she captures the vernacular of Maine beautifully. Annie Proulx, in the shipping news, one of the characters in a scene will be from Newfoundland and the other is from the Bronx. And you can always tell who's speaking because she gets the dialect of both cultures, So I think really good writers use that a lot. And it doesn't have to just be set in the South or, there are many dialects throughout the United States. Yes.
So I was intrigued by the map you put up there and what is Appalachia. Is the culture you're talking about distinctly Appalachian or is it more rural Eastern? As an Adirondacker, a lot of the stuff that you talk about is similar to what we have up in the hills. So I guess, how much do you want to lump things together or how distinctive is each region?
Well, I said the word rural a lot because most people think all of Appalachia, like central Appalachia, is rural. But when I'm talking about the Appalachia culturally, where I'm from, there are a lot of cities in that. There's Asheville, Knoxville, Charleston, West Virginia, Birmingham. There are several major cities within that area. So Appalachia isn't totally rural, but the idea we have of it, and the Appalachia I come from is rural. So I probably said that a lot. I have driven through the Appalachian part of New York State, and I always say this looks so much like Eastern Kentucky if Eastern Kentucky hadn't had coal. You know, because it's so much, it's not been as devastated, I think, because it didn't have as many of the natural resources that were just plundered after the Civil War. So I do think it's very similar, you know, and there are parts of Ireland and Scotland that feel very similar as well in that way. But I think when I'm talking about my definition of Central Appalachia, a lot of it is economic, you know, and a lot of it is just like foodways, dialect, things of that nature. So the more you talk about, the smaller it gets when you go from the mountain range down to culturally. Does that make sense? Couple more? Anybody else? I will talk all night if you let me. I know we have to be out of here at a certain time, so yes.
Thank you so much for being so, just sharing your truth. I really appreciate it. You had showed some images of Nina Simone and Zora Neale Hurston and the book by Alice Walker. And I was just wondering, what was your experiences when we think about race in interacting with people who are different from yourself in the community that you grew up in?
Thank you. One reason that that I put an emphasis on that is because everybody, I mean, I've had people say to me, Black people don't live in Appalachia, or they'll say queer people don't live in Appalachia. You know, there's this idea that to be Appalachian, you must be white or you must be rural or whatever. And so I want people to know that that's not true, that there is diversity within the region. And I actually think it does a real disservice to people of color and queer people, you know, it's erasure to say they don't exist in a place. I grew up in a very segregated town. I grew up in a sundown town. I don't know if that's a term that people in the North know, but it basically means, you know, that people of color it's known to not be in that town after dark. And often sundown towns have been the places of white riots in the past, like where white people rioted against Black residents. And so there are towns throughout Appalachia that are historically Black, like the town of in Harlan County, for instance, is a lot, there's a huge Black population. So the diversity tended to just be, it's there, but it's segregated, you know? And I think those things have lasted longer to some degree in Appalachia. That's another thing that's hard to talk about. A lot of Appalachian gatekeepers don't want to admit things like that, but I just think we need to tell, you can only make change happen if you acknowledge that it's there. You know, so I think it does have a long way to go in that way, but it still doesn't mean that the people aren't there. And so I want to make sure people know that they are there. I'm really lucky to teach at a small liberal arts college that was founded by abolitionists in Appalachia. And it was very intentionally put in that place because it was, you know, it was slave territory. And they wanted to be where people were enslaved and to be integrating classes. And so, you know, I teach a lot of Appalachian people of color. And so I know, you know, I'm very aware of their contributions to the region. Are we out of time? Thank you all so much. I appreciate you listening to me.
As we wrap things up, you know, events like this evening require a lot of work, and I just want to, as we prepare to leave, express some appreciation to some of the women and men who helped make tonight possible. Certainly want to thank members of the Fitzpatrick family. I want to thank, again, President Stout and Vice President Morris for their encouragement, support. Canisius student Hawa Saleh helped organize an event for earlier today where Silas got to spend some time with some of our students. And I really enjoyed that. The staffs of the academic affairs offices, marketing and communications, event services have been especially helpful. I think most of all, since she's still here, I definitely want to say it. Maggie Burkhardt deserves extra recognition for the work and help that she puts in for these sort of events. And so I thank her. Yeah, I want to thank Silas again for joining us for such an engaging and relevant conversation. Thank you for coming. If you'd like more information about future Fitzpatrick events, please catch me. I have some cards I can give you one so you can email me, make certain you get on an email list. One announcement before we leave that I want to make in that regard is that on Saturday, May the 13th, we will be hosting a special Fitzpatrick lecture that evening as a part of the city's Day of Remembrance for last year's shooting at the Tops Market. So at 7 p.m. on May the 13th, in this space, we'll be hearing from Father Brian Massengale, a noted Catholic Jesuit ethicist. He regularly writes about racial justice in the Catholic Church. He's going to join us that evening. So we'd love to have you make plans to join us. We'll have posters and such up soon, and you'll hear about it on WBFO and we'll get that news out. But beyond that event, we are working already on some speakers for next year, the next few years. Really hope we're able to share exciting news about that soon. Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for those of you who tuned in via live stream. Please be safe until we can gather again. Thank you and have a good evening.